So we are going to get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Roberta Pierfederici. I'm a policy advisor at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment at the London School of Economics. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event organized in collaboration with Ecologic Institute on the topic of a win-win agenda for climate development and trade, how an inclusive climate club and trade policy can be part of the solution. We have a very distinguished panel here today who is joining us in person and online. So it's my great pleasure to welcome here in the room with me Ludvinta Miotti, Head of Environment Section at the Trade and Environment Division at the WTO, Madeleine Tuniha, Head of Trade and Development Unit at the European Commission DG Trade, and David Kleiman, Visiting Fellow at Bruegel and Senior Associate at E3G. Welcome. And online, we have Michael Jacob, Senior Fellow at Ecologic Institute and co-organizer of this event, Dane Kyriakopoulou, who is Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute, London School of Economics, Andrew Lang, Professor of International Law and Global Governance at the University of Edinburgh, and Kuki Sujatchmoon, Founder and Executive Director of the Indonesia Research Institute for Decarbonization. Thank you all for joining us today. So before we turn to our panelists, let me introduce the topic of this event. So today we would like to discuss how international cooperation and an inclusive climate club can accelerate climate action and how trade can be part of the solution. As we know, climate change is the single most urgent issue that humanity is facing now, and the impacts of climate change are already evident today. Despite some progress made in the past few years, including at the recent COP26 in Glasgow, collective action to address climate change has fallen short. There is now a growing consensus that we need to go much further and faster, and this decade could be the last window of opportunity to ramp up ambition. In this context, a stronger policy agenda at the intersection of climate, development, and trade is crucial to ensure a credible transition towards net zero. The WTO already started the process, and since the last ministerial meeting in June, climate change is now fully recognized as part of the WTO agenda. When we look at the various policy instruments that countries are putting forward to address climate change, like for instance, CBAMs, green subsidies or standards, they all show a linkage with trade. And the recent advancements in climate legislation in the European Union and the US are also highlighting the importance of the climate and trade nexus. This discussion is indeed very timely, as also the German G7 presidency has recently put forward a proposal for an inclusive climate club to be established by the end of this year, with the goal of accelerating action on climate change. The Climate Club will be an intergovernmental and inclusive arrangement consistent with international rules, including trade rules, with the goal of bringing countries together to accelerate action on climate change. The German G7 presidency commissioned the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics to prepare an independent report to provide recommendations on principles and design features of the Climate Club. The report looks across a wide range of actions in terms of managing trade frictions arising from policy diversity, building partnerships for technology and finance, as well as promoting sectoral alignment. The report was discussed last week with the G7 finance ministers in Washington and is now being publicly released. So I'd like now to invite my colleague and co-author of the report, Dane Kyriakopoulou, who is joining us online to present some of the key recommendations of the report as an introduction to the panel discussion. Dane, over to you.
Thank you, Roberta. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. So let me go through the presentation of the report. As Roberta said, this is intended to be an intergovernmental arrangement to reach agreement on pushing further and accelerating action on climate change. It has been presented by the German G7 presidency this year.
I'm sorry to intervene. There seems to be an echo. Do you have something else? Another source of sound on, or I don't know, there's a really strong echo and the interpreters don't manage to listen to properly interpret.
No, I don't have something else on. Does someone else have the sound? Maybe if you mute the room. Does that work better for the interpreters?
Can you try speaking again, Dana?
Yes, testing. Does that work better?
There's still an echo from our side. Do you have a headphone that you could use, please?
No, I don't, I'm afraid.
Okay, then let's carry on for now and we'll see how
Okay.
it goes. Thank you.
It was put on the agenda by the German G7 presidency. There was a statement on the 28th of June at the G7 leaders statement, and making it very clear that the aim is to establish the club by the end of this year. And a task force of designated ministries by the G7. As Roberta mentioned, there was a request for our team led by Lord Stern to prepare a report outlining the recommendations of how this climate club should be set up. And we discussed this in Washington last week. It was well received by the G7 finance ministers as well as the central bank governors, and it is likely to be on the agenda of COP27. I'll go through the principles of establishing the climate club. First, we pick out three broad principles. The first is ambition. This is in terms of climate action and climate ambition, but also goes beyond that. It needs to be a positive agenda. It needs to connect climate to sustainable growth and development. This is very important in terms of our interpretation for ambition, and the implications for that is in terms of enabling investment, innovation, and finance to deliver that ambition. So it's as much about climate leadership as it is about growth and development leadership. And this is very important also when we think later on about its membership. And the second principle is that of respect for international rules, very importantly, the Paris process, but also international trade rules. And this needs to support the targets of the annual UNFCCC process and support going beyond that in terms of higher targets, more ambitions, but importantly, not to supplant the UNFCCC process, not to create parallel tracks, but to strengthen, support, and reinforce initiatives under the Paris umbrella. And that has important implications for the structure, as we will see, in terms of not creating a new institution, but rather a process that supports existing institutions and initiatives. On trade as well, respect for international rules means observing WTO legal principles, not discriminatory, not arbitrary, not distortive, and other colleagues and co-authors will speak more about this later on today. Respecting for rules also means understanding that members will have different starting positions, and that is the principle of common but differentiated responsibility that is very important as well. The third principle we highlight is that of inclusiveness. That was very strongly emphasized in the statement on the 28th of June in terms of establishing an inclusive climate club, but we take this in our report even further. Not just inclusive in terms of the types of countries, in terms of their level of development, but also in terms of the policies that they may have. We understand that some countries may be moving ahead with pricing policies and CBAMs, others with non-price policies in terms of regulations in industry and technology. And we recognize that there will be considerable variation. This needs to be welcome in the club, and that it will not be realistic to expect these types of policy approaches to fully harmonize. This is not the objective of the club as we see it. There also has to be inclusiveness in terms of the motivations for joining the club. That has to be inclusive in terms of recognizing that different member states will have different incentives. The initial proposal in the Nordhaus kind of club theory was about a collective action problem that required some punitive measures to encourage collaboration. We see also that some aspects of the club will be more collaborative in their nature in terms of capturing coordination, synergies, sectoral agreements, and that is also part of the different motivations that members may have. And linked to that is also the diversity of club goods in terms of partnership, managing policy diversity, and sectoral alignment. And these are reflected in the structure of the club as we see it in terms of the different pillars on which it is based. And very connected to this principle of inclusiveness is also our questioning of the very name of this project as a climate club. We don't think this sets the right tone. We've highlighted this in the report itself. And in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, at least, it has a more exclusive connotation when you think of a club. So this is something that we have highlighted as well. So in terms of the agenda, as I mentioned, this is a process, not treaties. The aim is not to create a new institution, but to create an aspirational and cooperative arrangement for discussing challenges, for agreeing how to pursue beneficial solutions, but working within the existing institutional landscape. And there may be some examples for that. There may be some existing arrangements, for example, on product standards that can be strengthened and enlarged and get more members behind them, country cooperation platforms, as we've seen in South Africa and now in Indonesia, and also within the WTO in terms of green standards, duty subsidies, etc. And then we see the Climate Club organized around 3 pillars, reflecting these different motivations for joining. These are very much the pillars that were highlighted in the G7 leader statement, but also we've highlighted much more centrally the partnership pillar. This comes first in our interpretation. I won't go into the details, but it's more about finance and technical assistance, technology transfer vehicles, enabling countries that have the ambition, but not necessarily the means to deliver on it, to do so. The second pillar is that of managing policy diversity, and that is not the process of creating a common CBAM, rather it is understanding and measuring and monitoring policies and outcomes, agreeing principles around carbon-related border measures. And the third pillar is that of sectoral alignment in terms of setting decarbonization paths for hard-to-abate sectors, but also setting common standards and innovation for low-carbon or zero-carbon technologies as well. And we see the 3 pillars working together dynamically over time. If countries can be supported through sectoral alignment initiatives and partnerships to have greater levels of ambitions, we envisage that over time there will be less of a need for climate-related border measures as levels of ambition harmonize. And let me say some words on the governance and the architecture of the club. To close, so membership is a tricky balancing act if we want to have both the principle of inclusiveness but also achieve critical mass. There will be some trade-offs. It needs to cover the systemic countries, particularly main emitters, but at the same time has to be inclusive from the start, including developed and developing economies. In terms of the structure, we see this similar or borrowing principles from both the G20 and the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. In terms of the G20, because it is a leaders level initiative, and in terms of the coalition, because it has this structure of being co-led by developed and developing emerging economies. And that has to happen from the start. It has to be supported by a secretariat that will be drawn from international institutions, and also have working groups at below leaders levels working on the thematic pillar and sponsored at the top of government. A question to close with is very important. What value add does the Climate Club bring? There is a very crowded landscape of many initiatives. foreign institutions, we think the Climate Club would be unique in that it would combine a set of features that are present individually in some of the existing initiatives, but there is no body that really combines them all in terms of combining engagement at the top. Yes, it's there at the G20, at the G7, at the UNFCCC, but not there at the Coalition of Finance Ministers or NGFS, for example. It would combine shared member ambition that is somewhat lacking in the UNFCCC, that has no criteria in terms of how countries enter the process, critical mass in terms of emissions coverage, that is very important, a focus on the climate agenda exclusively, again, that is absent from the G20 or G7, where climate is one of the topics, and a comprehensive topical governance to support cross-cutting negotiations, again, that bargaining across pillar, if you like. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, for the excellent introduction. And we are gonna get into the discussion part of the event now. And I'd like to invite each of the panelists to provide some initial remarks on what role they see a Climate Club can play in accelerating climate action, how in their view international cooperation on trade policy can contribute to this mission, and how the WTO can support the implementation of the climate agenda. I'd like to start with David, who's here in the room with me. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation of the organizers, and congratulations to the authors really on such a superb and comprehensive report. I've been spending a good amount of energy and time over the past year to battle with the notion of an exclusive climate club, which is, you know, as you said beforehand, the brainchild of William Nordhaus and the proposition of some US and EU think tankers and US politicians in particular who are sort of using or trying to use the notion of an exclusive climate club to battle the adversaries in Russia and China. So this is sort of a narrative that has been formed in the US. I think a lot of us agree by now that the exclusive carbon club is, you know, somewhat technically unfeasible nor politically desirable, based on the notion that you know, sort of a common carbon price is somewhat impossible to achieve, and therefore there's no real benchmark for an adjustment at the border across nations. And I was particularly delighted when the German proposal for an open and inclusive climate club was floated last summer, mostly because the German paper was very useful, a very useful antithesis to the proponents of ideas that would compartmentalize the world into clean and dirty countries on the basis of questionable benchmarks for border adjustments. Now, conceptually, what is being proposed here, I think, is not a climate club, but is a cooperation platform. So I would hope that at some point we would really drop this terminology, and some people have, in fact, you know, somewhat suggested that the alliance, a climate alliance, would be a better term. But of course, it needed, you know, the German proposal needed a lot of fleshing out, and this is certainly the core achievement of this report. Again, congratulations to achieving that. I cannot think of anything that has not been addressed in this report. Perhaps the organizational architecture still remains a bit vague, but that's really all at this point. I think everything that supporters of a multilateral climate club could possibly address is on the menu. We have agenda setting and flexible coordination of cooperation and cooperation. We have financial partnerships, technology partnerships, managing friction and policy diversity, inclusiveness of membership, respect for international law and engagement with existing organizations such as the WTO, ambition for policy convergence over time, cooperation towards agreements on environmental subsidies, government procurement, standard setting, roadmaps, R&D, and investments. So this is all wonderful and very, very ambitious. Now, to contribute a little bit to the discussion, perhaps allow me to play the devil's advocate here as a proponent of an inclusive climate club, and as an opponent of the exclusive climate club, and remind us perhaps of the benchmark for assessment provided by Robert Falconer et al. That is, that any multilateral club proposal needs to consider how it would add and not distract from the multilateral climate regime and national industrial decarbonization. Or said differently, what are the risks and the costs of failure of setting up such a wide-ranging institution with such a wide-ranging mandate? Now, as a child of the 1980s and the 1990s, I'm very much enchanted by all the rational proposals and optimistic proposals for multilateral cooperation. As an adult of the 2020s, I'm concerned that these proposals are rather utopian. But what is, so my question essentially is what the international political conditions are that would favor the establishment of this new and indeed urgently needed cooperation platform. We have the US that is in trouble to cooperate with itself and seeks to tame internal divisions via discriminatory climate and trade policies that compromise both the efficiency of climate policy rollouts and disregard third country interests. We have China that just discontinued the climate cooperation with the United States over a visit of a lawmaker in Taiwan. The US and the EU have engaged in negotiations of a sectoral exclusive climate club called the Global Steel and Aluminum Arrangement, which is really more of a transatlantic initiative towards building a steel cartel. So my question essentially, and these are just a couple of examples here, but my question really is, what are the political conditions that would favor the establishment of this organization other than the paragraphs that the G7 has included in its statement? And I'm reminded somewhat of the 2000s when the G7 somewhat continuously included the support for the conclusion of the Doha round, which was very high ambitions, but did not lead to, or they did not perhaps put the political will, or did not put the action where the written ambition was. So I'm a little bit skeptical as to how this could be achieved politically, but I would love to hear from others what their views are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your kind remarks on the report and also for bringing up a question on the risks and what are the conditions necessary to the creation of a climate club. So we are going to go back to that after we finish with the initial remarks. And I'm going to give the floor now to Andrew Lang, who's joining us online, for providing some initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and it's a real pleasure to be discussing the proposal. And I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. So what I thought I would do in my these opening 4 minutes was just to pick up the invitation to talk a little bit about the role that the WTO might play in relation to the Climate Club. And so what I wanted to do was just identify, literally name 6 governance tasks that I think will be necessary in order for the to work as envisaged, and then say just a few words, which we can elaborate later if we want, about how the WTO might contribute both directly and indirectly to those. So in terms of the 6 tasks, and these are by no means exhaustive, but here they are. So I think the first is the task of benchmarking climate policies against some kind of level of ambition. So this governance task of benchmarking. The second is assurance of governance systems. And what I mean by that is ongoing assurance of the operational credibility of different climate policies and measures in different countries, common measurement protocols, methodologies, processes for audit and certification, in order to ensure that each one is achieving the goals that they have set. The third task is monitoring, is the reflexive task of monitoring the impacts of these policies and also the Climate Club on emissions and revising the approach as necessary, so the ongoing monitoring task. Fourth is identifying key technologies, processes, products for targeted intervention, that, through sustainability standards or some other form of categorization. So a shared sense of what are the key future-looking green technologies, processes, and products. Fifth, monitoring and managing the very real shifts in competitive conditions, which will occur as a result of climate action generally. This is the managing frictions issue. And then sixth, ensuring conformity with international law, including international trade law. So as I say, they are 6 discrete governance tasks, related but discrete. I choose them because I think for all of them, I think the WTO has a role to play in contributing to that. So the reports are moving just to the second part. The report emphasizes the role of the WTO as a key institutional partner. I think that's a really important theme of the report. At a very general level, I think the WTO brings a lot to this sort of project. I would mention just 3 key things. 1, the legitimacy of a multilateral institution. 2, a very high level of technical capacity. And 3, a whole range of existing governance procedures, negotiations, but not just negotiations, which can be harnessed towards these governance tasks. So maybe more specifically, I know I have probably 1 minute left, maybe to say just a few specific things about the contribution that existing WTO mechanisms might play in relation to those tasks. So for example, using the analogy of the specific trade concern in the committee procedure, I think there's an important role, there's a potential role for that sort of mechanism to play in monitoring the external impacts of climate policies, for example, on non-members of the Climate Club, monitoring and prospectively identifying potentially unanticipated problems, trying to address those cooperatively through that sort of mechanism. Second, in relation to the committee process, again, and the whole range of policy dialogue processes which do occur within the WTO, I think there's definitely a role for those mechanisms to play, for example, in setting up days of discussion around key with key standard setting organizations, sharing practices and experiences in this area, perhaps over time developing some guidelines and best practices around in this area. And then maybe two more quick points. One, in terms of the normative processes of WTO law negotiations, I think there's clearly a role to play for the WTO in terms of identifying key environmental goods and services for targeted liberalization. And I'm sure others will mention also the potential for subsidies negotiations to deal partly with harmful, environmentally harmful subsidies. I think at a more general level, and here my model is the guidelines on equivalence assessments, which have been promulgated by the SPS committee. I think there's a role for that sort of normative work to be carried out again here in terms of guiding the process of assuring and understanding the equivalence of different climate policies. And then finally, in terms of that governance task of ensuring legal conformity with international trade law, I think there's a huge variety of different softer and harder mechanisms that the WTO has at its disposal to help bring greater clarity, I think, to existing international trade disciplines, both through technical assistance, but also through semi-formal and formal mechanisms for clarifying key principles. So that really, I'm offering those thoughts as, I guess, seeds for discussion if necessary. I'm happy to elaborate on any of them, but essentially that was a set of thoughts around how the WTO and the Climate Club might work together in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. And we are gonna get over to Cookie. Please, thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me. And I think I will look at things from more from the developing countries and also emerging economies point of view. That you know, like it's good to hear that the Climate Club will be more inclusive, and also, you know, like the principles that have been mentioned earlier. It's also something that I think more promising compared to what we've heard at the beginning, that specifically, you know, focusing on a certain policy. And I think the policy mix is something that is important for having, you know, like developing countries and emerging economies to be, if I can say, member of the Climate Club as well, so that they can also, in a way, you know, like depending on their situation, depending on their capacity as well, they still can be a part of the Climate Club. And I think if we are talking again about the different capacity, and especially for developing countries and the emerging economies, because most of them basically haven't had, like, if I can say, proper maybe proper policies on some of the issues like the carbon pricing, and which will somehow relate to the CBAM later. But also, if we are talking about the several sectors that being discussed, that might be targeted later, this is also something that will help, I think, developing countries and emerging economies to accelerate their actions. Because, for example, for a number of industries that, if I can say, emission intensive, then they really need a lot of support to be able to get into, or to be at a certain level of maturity, so that they can have less emission. And this is something that I think will be good to be, you know, somehow to be developed together, because it's a partnership, right? So it can be developed together to help that particular developing countries or emerging economies to be part of the club. And by that then they can also reduce their emission while still doing development accordingly. So I think I'll just stop there.
Many thanks, Cookie, for bringing developing country perspective to the conversation. And I'm going to go back to the room now and ask Ludwin to give us her take on the topic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much as well for this invitation. Just to start with, and pardon me in advance with a disclaimer, I will not speak on behalf of members, and will simply try to contribute to the discussion in an informal way. I think first I would like to thank also Andrew, because he has very well done actually my job to already highlight quite a number of potential contributions of the WTO to the debate, and thank him for this. And I think what he said really many of the points he mentioned is directions I wanted to guide you through also in my remarks now. I think to start, the report is great. It's very, very interesting and really, really well done. And I found a very good contribution of this discussion here on Climate Club is to bring to the forefront the discussion on the importance of engagement and the importance of coherence between policies. And I think that's a very positive point. And if I look at from my perspective and the work that I'm doing, working for the Committee on Trade and Environment, the goal of the Committee on Trade and Environment is to bring together members to one forum, to make them speak, to let them speak about trade and environment issues and the connection between trade policies and environmental policies. And I found the report on carbon clubs brings an additional food for thought in this discussion by really forcing us to look into how to try to improve this coherence at the multilateral level between policies. And the WTO as such, both in the way rules have been interpreted in the past and in the mechanisms that it has through the various committees, has always been about promoting harmonization. And I'm not talking only about harmonization in the stricter sense of harmonization of international standards, but harmonization taken more broadly with coherence. If you look at cases, environment cases that were brought in the past, the appellate body always brought up this aspect of this issue or this concept of making sure that the coherence between the different elements of a regulatory effort, and that if you do provide for a strong trade measures or discriminate or trade restrictive measure, this needs to be done in a coherent way, that the measure will achieve the objective it's supposed to do. So I think what is very good about this discussion on Carbon Club is that it forces us to really look at this at the landscape of measures that our members are taking for climate purposes, and try to encourage and foster coherence between these measures. Andrew mentioned equivalence, and I think it's a very important concept in WTO discussions. It's very much used to, and some concept that is key in the implementation of the TBT agreement, the Technical Barriers to Trade agreement. And I think there are lots of avenues to look into or things to learn from in the way the TBT committee is working when exploring the need for more coherence between the different measures that the countries are taking for climate purposes. Because in the TBT context, harmonization is key, but also there is an encouragement to try to seek equivalence agreement or mutual recognition agreements. And I think this concept is a very good one, because the idea is to really to make sure to avoid trade frictions by recognizing each other's different pathways to a common objective. And the goal of harmonization is that it's not for everyone to do the same thing, but for everyone to do the things in a way that is coherent and working together. And I think a discussion on clubs like this fosters this idea a bit further, especially in the meaning that you have highlighted, and then I highlighted from the beginning the non-punitive meaning. So the meaning of really having a cooperative mechanism to discuss how to go higher in the level of ambitions, and to make sure that everyone is involved, and there is a strong inclusivity in the process. And so in terms of how the WTO can contribute, I think we can contribute indeed in some of the concepts that we have ingrained in some of our agreements, like I mentioned the TBT agreement, but also the way Article 20 of the GATT has been interpreted. I think you have a lot of information there that is useful to show how the key element is really to seek the achievement of the environmental objective. And in order to do that, when you speak about climate change, if you want to achieve the environment goal of climate mitigation or adaptation, you need coherence between the policies. Such a global issue needs to be done in a way that has some coherence between its different elements. Another side of contribution, more in terms of discussions, is what is already taking place in several forums in the WTO right now. We have, of course, the Committee on Trade and Environment, And this is, you know, an ancient committee in the sense that it dates back from the 90s, but it has over the years renewed its role, you know, from generation to generation. I would say there have been really an adaptation to how the city can help members discuss core issues, and we have seen it with the absolutely amazing contribution and help from I mean and efforts from the EU in bringing to the Committee on Trade and Environment information, transparency on the measures that they are taking with the EU Green Deal, and this, I mean, I didn't count actually how many meetings, but regularly every meeting for I think at least the last 2 years, the EU is bringing information every time, more detailed information on certain different aspects of the EU Green Deal to trigger a conversation in the city. And I think I would say particularly on Monday, I was quite amazed by the number of comments that other members made on the different aspects of the EU Green Deal that were presented, and concrete comments were raised in this context. So I think the city plays its role right now of hosting a conversation on the current trade policy or policies that the country is taking, and the complexities that it involves. Climate change is a very, very complex issue. I don't need to say that, and the way this is being discussed in the city, I think is very useful to have. And then we have a number of other forums for discussion, which all can contribute in their own capacity to the debate and to help a little bit in the discussion on Carbon Club, and also on harmonization and coherence between climate measures. I mean, there is the discussion that are taking place in the most directly related to that, the discussion taking place in the TSD forum, so the Trade and Environment Sustainability Structure discussion. There is a part of the work which relates to climate-related trade measures, and this is really a very important place to discuss current issues in relation to that, and certainly the work being done on Carbon Club can be of very can really help contribute to the discussion there. There is also the discussions in the dialogue on plastic pollution. We just had an event just before this one, and here the speakers, several of the speakers have highlighted the link to climate change, and so there again, the interesting thing about the plastic pollution part is that it's a very, another speaker was saying it this morning, it's a very targeted and focused issue. So in a way, it should be a little bit easier, even though nothing is easy in this world on environment issues, but it helps sort of focus the discussion on one particular topic, and there show how this can also contribute to climate mitigation in some aspects, and show the ramifications. And then, of course, the discussion on fossil fuel subsidy reform is also very relevant to the Climate Club discussion. So in a way, all of these three groups plus the CTE, this is already a convergence of or cooperation platforms. I think David was mentioning this wording. I think it's a different cooperation platforms to try to achieve a common goal of having all energies being put together in the same direction. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ludwin, for highlighting how the WTO can contribute to this very important topic, and also the importance of the coherence and harmonization across climate policy, but also between climate policy and trade policy. Thank you again, and I'll turn to Madeleine. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, early good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me, and above all, thanks a lot for all this important work that indeed stimulate our thinking on how to move this forward. After having listened to Andrew and to Ludivine and to David, I can just complement something. So I'll take out what is repetitive. Maybe in terms of the three questions you pose, so what role can a climate club play in accelerating climate action? I think it depends very much on the design. We've actually tried to start mapping all the various initiatives that are there and what their perceived or stated objective is and outputs. Because if you want to be complementary, which is probably the only way that this can work, you need to be well aware of what these others are. So it depends on the design, principally, and this is what the echo I take from Dana from your presentation is that needs to be open, inclusive forum to raise climate ambition. What's very important, and that has been said here also, that it cannot be an exclusive club, and certainly also not to just raise competitiveness of club members. I think we would come directly at odds of many who are sitting here around the table. We're looking at climate measures that are taken to raise climate ambition and not to distort the competition amongst us. And of course, therefore, needs to comply with international rules. Now, the complementarity is not easy when you come to this, an open inclusive forum. So you get the membership and who's the member and not. Is it G7? Is it G20? Is it the big emitters or not? If I look at how we are going about TESTI and the plurilaterals in WTO, it has grown much more organically. There's no entry fee, if you want. There's always this club has an entry fee edition. But if you look at what the composition now is of the three plurilateral statements, it's very much been the thinking of an overall umbrella statement combining three initiatives that have come up because of the members-driven organization. Plastics was very much put forward by developing country, TESTI combination, and then the fossil fuels, the smaller number of members, but that has gradually grown. You didn't need to be member to all of them and participate in all of them, but we're all trying to pursue it and learn from the discussions that are there, what this nexus is between trade and climate. So that membership is certainly not the same membership, or it doesn't look like the same membership that is in the other one. And in order to be complementary, that of course is going to play a role. So how could international cooperation on trade policy and rules contribute to this mission? On the WTO track, I think, Ludivine, you've very well said it. I'm also impressed with the Committee on Trade and Environment, how it is moving up and also accepted to move up. I think a couple of years ago, we could not use the word climate. We could not have climate in the agenda. I think today it's accepted that we are collectively working on these climate objectives and that has an impact on trade, and that the subsequent question is, how can you do that in the best way? Of course, the tension, and this is, I said on Monday, I feel the most popular girl in town because we had so much attention, but it's extremely positive because it forces you to go at why did you make these policy choices? And I always say, look at our impact assessments. You see the choices we made. This is the choice that we made. We're happy to discuss them. Is it due diligence? Is it labeling? Is it other type of mechanism that you need for a particular given measure? And that's a type of discussion we should have. Accepting together that what we pursue are lifting our climate objectives in Paris. What does that mean for trade policy, and how do you do that then in a way that is non-discriminatory and etc. So that's, I think, is a very important function where there's a lot of scope for work. Also between the communities, not only the trade community, but the trade in relation to other communities, because what I always feel is that we're looked at as, oh, you're these boring technical WTO compatibility people. But behind WTO compatibility, there's a huge policy issue behind it because we're part of a global world. And then you have this goes well beyond the classical thinking that people have when you look at the WTO and environment. For a long time it has been you eliminate some tariffs and then you've contributed to the climate. The debate goes well beyond that, and gets you into facilitating, actually more the discussion of facilitating goods and services and investments and platforms to share best practices on regulatory issues. Very important in this also, how do we provide support to the developing countries? And I saw that in your presentation, Diana, it very much comes to technical assistance. I would be a bit concerned if now in all these different fora we try to do the same and repeat the same blocks of things, which is happening a bit, but you need to bundle together your assistance and see how you do that in a coherent way. The conveying power of the WTO used to smooth frictions and support the implementation of the agenda. I think that follows very much from what I've been saying, discussion and the deliberating function of it. Focus on the positive agenda. So maybe I'll leave it here because I see you need to watch the time a bit.
Thank you so much, Madeleine, for your very interesting contribution. So I'd like to give Michael now, who's joining online, the opportunity to ask some questions to the panel. Over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was a very insightful discussion. Thanks to all the panelists for providing their insights. I have a very general question. I was wondering, if you look at the existing body of WTO rules, of laws, of jurisprudence we have, which changes or which actually progress in terms of aligning the climate and the trade agenda can be made within the given rules we have, and where would we actually need to develop new rules or change existing ones? And what do you think are the most important areas where we need to move forward? And
So
I would like
perhaps,
to address
Ludwig, you want to answer on that?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Michael, for the questions. So there are two sides. So in terms of existing rules and sort of playing with the framework of the existing rules, I think I was just starting to say it earlier, but we have already a very good framework that gives us some ideas of how to provide some context on how to elaborate trade restrictive environment regulatory measures. And we have put together a couple of years back with a colleague a small booklet which you can find online if you are interested, which is meant to simplify a little bit of the key elements, the criteria that needs to be looked at when a country is elaborating a measure, a trade restrictive measure for environmental purposes, and we based this on the case law. So we looked very precisely at the trade and environment case law, and what comes out of this key criteria is that you need to make sure that the measure is really able to achieve the environmental objective it is stating it is supposed to achieve, and you need to have some coherence between the different elements of your measure. And what is interesting is that if you look at the case law, there's really no sort of limit in terms of trade restrictiveness that one could use in order to achieve an environmental measure. In fact, if you look at the past cases, there were even sort of cases where, following the an appellate body finding, the logic change in the regulations was to have even more trade restriction in order to be logic. I'm thinking of the EU tires case, sorry, retreated tires, that's the word I was looking for, retreated tires case. And in fact, as a follow-up, there were even more restrictions involved in this, in the way retreated tires and used tires were being considered. So I think there are lots there in the case, in the existing principles from the case law that can be useful. Second point, the need for new rules, second part of your question. I think we need to think a little bit differently in terms of rule making in a way. You know, we know, all of us know here how difficult it is to change rules in a multilateral context. And so I think there are other avenues, maybe. I mean, some people are speaking about it as soft law, but I don't necessarily like so much this expression, because we are still sort of linked to the legal aspect. And more, I think there are more that can be worked in committees in terms of guiding principle, guidelines that you know, they to be something legally binding, if we want to use this expression, but they are providing good ideas and good guidelines and guidance to members to know what to do in order to implement something that would work and work for everyone. So I'll stop there because I'm aware of time, but thank you very much for the questions.
Thank you, Ludwin. And perhaps, Andrew, you want to add a couple of words? Please.
I'm happy to, and I realize I put my hand up, though, of course, Ludwig has more or less said what I wanted to say, but maybe just a few quick points. So one, very quickly. So one is the question of compatibility is very important, but I would not want, one of the reasons I put that last in my list of governance tasks was so that we didn't get caught up on that question and centralize it as the most important. It's a super important question, but it would be a shame if that were emphasized rather than the question of how WTO processes can be used in support. Secondly, I mean, the legal questions are very complex. So partly because you have a number of agreements on the WTO side, the GATT subsidies agreement, and so on, and partly because you have many different kinds of climate policies which you would then have to assess for compatibility. I think that the broad outline, Ludwig, that you gave and drawing on previous work of the WTO is, I mean, absolutely bang on. There is nothing per se in WTO law which precludes measures of this kind, even where they are trade distortive in some way, provided they really do achieve an objective. They're not arbitrary, they're not discrimination, they're evidence-led and so on. And I just would maybe second the point that Ludwig made that, you know, these genuinely normative processes within committees, even at a slightly higher level through ministerial declarations and so on, where one builds support for general principles and this question of guidelines, I think that's really important and much more practical and likely than getting concrete changes to WTO treaty texts. And so I really think that is a very important part of this story.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'd like to go back to David. Oh, please. Yes, Madeleine.
No, I find this question extremely relevant, and maybe just from say a practitioner, if we can say, no need to say the EU has gone through a massive amount of measures, and we're not there. We're still halfway of the Green Deal, of which many are the category of PPMs. Which has been a massive change in how we're going to deal with that, because I think up to then we were dealing with one PPM and sort of, and there is, I mean, you have the legal aspects of it, but we also had to do a good deal of thinking on the policy aspects of it, and it is not, and this is why I'm in agreement with you, rather look at best practices and that type of thing than rule setting, because you can't oversee the entire world, what is coming to you. It's actually really by digging into a deforestation proposal, by digging into all these individual sets of what the best policy mix is of your answer. And what you will see then is that if you want to achieve your climate or environment ambition, in most cases, you may have an international standard, but they're not always there, or they're not always there yet. And if your argument is that there's an urgency to address this, you may need to go beyond an international standard. And what is then the policy choice you make? Is that the end of the road and you're just going to say, I'm going to do unilaterally my measure? Or do you have a parallel engagement and strategy to develop in another form in international standard? And that combination is going to be critical. You see it already in the discussion, because people will say, there's no international standard. No, but I can't wait for that. That's my argument, which then pleads for this collaboration between the institutions, because we will need the FAO and others to set that international standards and advance on that, so that causes less trade restriction and we can facilitate it. So just to add that this is really a dynamic area, I think, linking also to other bodies.
So thank you, Madeleine. And I'd like to go back to David's remarks and his question on what are the risks involved in the creation of a multilateral arrangement, and what type of international political conditions will favor the creation of a climate club. And I'd like to ask Dane first to react quickly on that before I think she's gonna need to leave soon the meeting. So please, Dane, if you want to say a couple of words on this.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Sorry,
can
Dani.
you-
So I was just going back to David's remarks on what are the risks involved in the creation of a multilateral arrangement and what international political conditions will favor the creation of a climate club.
Thank you. Yes, this is very important in terms of getting from the design to the action. I think on the risks, what we've highlighted in the report is the risks of undermining existing arrangements. That has been a very real reaction to the report that we've received on the preparation of the report. But also, I think as it was put of the ambition and the optimism of setting these types of arrangements. It's been a very different world when we started thinking about this, when Chancellor at the time, Finance Minister Scholz, presented the idea last summer versus to where we are now. And it's a very different world in terms of international cooperation, the prospect of putting countries in a club now in the context of a war, of a conflict, of intense geopolitical tensions around the energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, is now a very different proposition to what it was at the time, and that has certainly complicated the task of proposing a climate club in the way that we have. But also in terms of the climate agenda itself, when we think back to the climate optimism in Glasgow at COP26, the momentum of the climate agenda in finance and beyond, and where we are now, where we see a lot of countries taking perhaps the wrong lessons in terms of going back to fossil fuels and prioritizing seemingly or perceived conflicting objectives to the climate agenda. So I think it's a very important question to ask. What I would emphasize there is that this is now even more important to forge cooperation in an area like climate, where there are objectives that are shared, even at a time of fractured geopolitics. And this underscores that this is an area where we can still see the G7 and beyond economies cooperating on this. And let's not forget that climate is one of the very few, perhaps the only issue where we've seen the China and the US coming out with a joint declaration in Glasgow last year, and even before that in Paris. And it is an area where we can kickstart again a more cooperative global geopolitical framework. But the reality is that it has become more difficult, and we have certainly observed that in the conversations we have had. But it was very encouraging that we saw these conversations at the G7 in Washington last week. But also beyond that, the conversations with a wider set of countries. I mentioned the country platform discussions with South Africa, preparations with Indonesia as well. And it will be really critical to see what the agenda moves to beyond the German presidency. Japan takes over from Germany next year, but critically also India takes over from Indonesia in the G20. So that will be a really big test to see whether India takes this on in the G20 agenda. And there have been discussions that this is certainly a prospect, and that would make a really big difference for this to be seen not just as a G7 initiative at this point, but also as something that in practice is co-led at the very start from emerging markets and developing economies, and India in particular in the leadership.
Thank you, Dane, and thanks also for mentioning the importance of developing countries and how the proposal of a climate club could be taken at the G20. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Kuki, as Indonesia is now leading the G20 this year. And so I would like to hear your take on this, especially given that the proposal of a climate club is relying on creating a critical mass that ensures that the proposal would be effective. And for this, we need to include developing countries in the proposal since the very start. So I would like to take your view on this.
Thank you. I think sorry. There are a number of issues. I know that like besides G7, we also have G20 that currently Indonesia is the presidency. But I think at this moment, understanding the geopolitics, then it's kind of a bit tricky, and I think if I can say, maybe difficult to bring this issue as a full package and to get buy-ins, full buy-ins kind of things. But I think the idea is something that need to be sent out from the G7 partners, G7 countries, to the discussion in the G20, and also to bring up that basically the current climate club is something that is more inclusive, and all the principles that being mentioned earlier, so that developing countries can see that this is not, as mentioned earlier, it's not about if I can say trading competition kind of thing, but it's more to help also not only developing countries in this case, but everyone to move together toward a better climate action, so that we can basically achieve the Paris goal target. So I think that's the situation at the moment, unfortunately. But I think this is not something that will be fully off the table, but this is something that we need to work further and shape the more narrative that can be, get the buy-in from developing countries and emerging economies. So maybe put more emphasis on the partnership and bring some, if I can say, examples or kind of pilot kind of things, so that this is something that can be seen as really happening, and this is something that realistic to happen in the future as well. Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you, Kuki. And I'd like to go back to the comments made previously by Ludwin on the importance of harmonization and coherence. So we know that, and this is something that we highlighted also in the report, that a higher degree of policy alignment across sectors is a way to reduce the risk of trade frictions. And so it is important to agree on common standards and sectoral strategies on industrial decarbonization. And I'm thinking about developing common definitions for green materials, as well as standards for public procurement, and also agreeing on common methodologies for measuring the carbon content of goods, which is something also particularly important for the smooth implementation of CBAMs. So I'd like to ask the panel here to provide some reflections on how we can ensure greater coherence across all of these issues, and what are the challenges and opportunities, especially for developing countries, for instance, in terms of demonstrating the carbon credentials of their products, and how do you see the Climate Club and the WTO to support these efforts? So perhaps, David, would you like to take the floor on this?
Thank you so much. I would perhaps just, recall one experience that I've made at the WTO quite recently, right before the WTO Public Forum, where one of your distinguished Deputy Director Generals convened a group of steel makers and government officials, as well as think tankers and academics, to think about the coherence of standard setting in the steel sector, which is absolutely crucial, because, as we know, it's 8% of global emissions, and we need to somehow get to the point where the fragmentation of steel emission carbon intensity standards will be reduced, or at least there will be some sort of coherence. And that was a wonderfully fruitful conversation, just to have a stock take at least on what is out there. And I think this is one of the first steps that can be done to make the WTO relevant in that space. in terms of standard setting coherence on decarbonization of certain sectors, and to move on from that process of initial stock take to go on and really foster common ideas on action, what could be done to bring coherence to this multiplicity of initiatives. I didn't know myself like how many different standard setting initiatives there are, and this is one of the things I think that can be that are very fruitful, and it's just been the start of a process, but this will be continued and hopefully successfully. So I wanted to mention just one, if I may, just one point on what can be done within the framework of existing rules, and this is also relates perhaps to the concept of coherence, and that relates to subsidies, which is also part of your report. One of the many objectives that you have, one of the many mandates that you want to include as part of the Climate Club, and that is the obvious lack of that, now expired Article 8 in the SCM agreement. We just had a rollout of major climate legislation in the United States. We have now new guidelines of the European Commission mandate, providing a framework for permissible subsidies relating to decarbonization. There are, and this is something that we should perhaps anticipate, that there will be likely major frictions, not only between those who are rolling out those massive subsidization schemes, which have net global welfare benefits, but also between those who can afford those subsidies and those who cannot. So, very much commend the idea of finding avenues like within the rules committee, within the subcommittee on subsidies, or within a Climate Club framework, etc., to come to starting a similar process on framing, or defining subsidies that will be permissible under WTO rules, and those that are not, at least, and whether that results in political agreement or even a legal agreement or a plurilateral set of rules is a different question. But it's one of these issues where coherence among different countries and initiatives would benefit, I believe.
Thank you, David. Madeleine, would you like to say a couple of words on this?
Coherence. No, I mean we are totally on the line of coherence and international alignment. I think there are several initiatives where this is now being taken forward within the context of the OECD, but the idea is that it is well beyond the OECD. We're of course looking at a number of underlying things. And that will be very, very important. I mean, the CBAM has its rhythm and will be taken forward, but it's very important indeed that we are aligned internationally, and that as we progress, that we also progress on the international front. So that is important, and there are some initiatives underway for that.
Thank you, Madeleine. And connected to this is the topic of the CBAM. So going back to the report, one of the key pillars of the Climate Club is managing policy diversity. And the report proposes the Climate Club to act as a forum to facilitate discussion and sharing of best practices to deal with policy divergence in collaboration with the WTO. So I'd like Kuki, perhaps, to gather your perspective again from the point of view of developing and emerging economies. So there are now different countries considering instruments like CBAMs, for instance, to support the domestic low carbon transition. What challenges and opportunities do you see for emerging and developing economies in this context?
All right. I think one of the thing that sorry, already mentioned earlier is like having this space of dialogue and also support each other, because if we are talking about CBAM and link it to the if I can say the domestic carbon pricing policy in that country, in the exporting country, then definitely there are a lot of things that need to be done in developing countries, right? And the emerging economies. So this is, I think this is exactly what the Climate Club can help, developing countries and emerging economies to support themselves in, let's say, having a better climate policy, including carbon pricing policies that is needed already in this stage, but at the same time also to help the whole process to come up as well, right? So if this can be done, and I think this is something that need to be done, then I don't think that it will be a big issue in terms of how do you call it, like rejection or things like that, but this will be a big issue if like you just have or decide a certain policy that need to be as if it has to be implemented everywhere as it is. So I think having this Climate Club as a platform for discussion, for capacity, if I can say, capacity building, helping each other, especially helping those exporting country to reach a certain level that can be accepted by the importing one, then that would be very useful, and it will help the particular country as well.
Thank you, Cookie. And we have a few minutes now for Q&A. So let me just turn it over to the audience in person. I'm going to start with a couple of questions. If there are any questions from the audience here in person, please raise your hand. Any question? No yet. Perhaps, Michael, you want to gather a couple of questions from the online audience?
Yeah, there have been quite a lot of interesting, good questions. So actually I have 4 questions here. And so it would be good if you could actually address all of them. The first one is from Aris Kalex. What will be the relationship between the Climate Club, the WTO, and the next COP27 negotiations in Egypt?
So yeah, Ludwig, please.
Thank you for the question. I mean, in terms of the COP27, the WTO will participate actively. We are working to have a good visibility at COP27. Our DG will participate in the high-level segment at the beginning of the COP. So there is a lot of efforts from the WTO Secretariat side to be involved at the highest level on climate negotiations. Climate Club as such is a bit more difficult to say, in the sense that I'm not aware of any sort of specific discussion that will feature there, but certainly I think putting aside the concept per se of Climate Club, I mean the messaging from the WTO and from our DG remains is clear. Is that the idea is to try to really show the extent to which WTO can contribute, can be part of the action towards climate mitigation, and that trade is a facilitating mechanism towards the goal of climate mitigation. So this will certainly be brought up in the context of the COP27 by the WTO, and I think fits in the discussion that we have today.
Thank you, Ludwig. I'd like to ask a follow-up question, going again back to the report on the importance of building partnerships. And as Dani highlighted in a presentation, the goal of the Climate Club should be to mobilize finance and investment and technology transfer and capacity building, especially for developing countries. And so I was wondering, so what is your take on current trade policies and rules in terms of their capacity of, let's say, support investments in innovation and transfer, or instead are they hindering these? And I'm talking, for instance, about tariff for low carbon products or green subsidies that have been mentioned before. So should we rethink the trade legal framework in a way that is able to better support investments and innovation and also technology transfer of low carbon products to developing countries? Perhaps, Andrew, do you want to have a go?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think that's a very, very important question. I mean, maybe I would just say maybe I would say one thing in response, and then if you don't mind, I have just a couple of things to say around the question of coherence from an earlier question. But you know, on this question of partnerships and support, I guess, you know, you mentioned what for me is probably the key issue, which is around you know, support for sustainable / green investment products, processes, and so on. And it does seem to me that, speaking in general terms only for the moment, that seems to be an area of WTO law where there is general consensus that some, at least, clarification is needed around and also some policy work is needed around the guidelines, guardrails, policy desirability of different kinds of subsidies, which will ease a transition to, which will ease the transition away from fossil fuels. That seems to me to be a pretty central question on which there is policy work to be done, which would no doubt affect either the interpretation or even the content of WTO law. So I think that's right. I think that's right. Sorry, I now see the time. I have some other things to say about coherence, but looking at the time, I'm going to stop myself.
Thank you, Andrew. Cookie, perhaps, do you want to have a go on this?
Sorry. Yeah, I think on that, as I already mentioned earlier, you know what basically this is the opportunity to have such climate club and to support, as well as Andrew mentioned earlier, right? I mean, like how, for example, the investment. I think partnership will come also, including the investment and all those parts. But it's not only the investment, because I think there are a number of things, including if you are talking about the policy, right? Because if we are talking about investment, then we may be, it will be go towards more on the sector or the industry. But if we are talking about the policy, then there is more things need to be done, and it's not really investment maybe, but this kind of you know, like helping each other to understand what is it that basically entails in this climate club as the element that need to be considered, or if I can say, maybe that any members can subscribe on a specific elements. Then what is it? Because then no one, I think, can subscribe to a specific element if they don't want, if they don't understand what is it, and it will, you know, like at the end, then there is a possibility that the policy that then you know, develop in that particular country may not fit to what we need, and it's something that, you know, something that we don't want to see, right? So I think this is where for me, like looking at the climate club from developing countries perspective, then this is really like a big opportunity, I can say, to move you know, forward together, and I think we can do that faster if we do together and hand in hand, rather than, you know, kind of blaming each other. So thanks, Roberta.
Thank you, Cookie. Madeleine, do you want to have a couple of words on how we can accelerate innovation and technology transfer through also collaboration between climate and trade policies?
In 1 minute. No, maybe to very briefly say, I think it's an important part in the puzzle. When we started the EGA, was really a long time ago. We were in a different setting. We were looking at the end use of a product, and the idea was we liberalize it and then we contribute to the climate. I think halfway, the EU at least said non-tariffs is also an important part of it, but it became a very NTB discussion. And the development angle was put in there mostly under the angle of differential tariff treatment, classical trade. I think in today's world, and you see it already in the statement of TESDI and all the things that come together, whatever we do needs to have a comprehensive package, because liberalizing, eliminating a tariff was one of your questions on a renewable would in a way send a message to the country whom you asked to eliminate the tariff. You need to, if I were EU or US or it would be a request to import my products. And in the WTO logic, of course, the idea is that you can exchange trade. So what will this country say? So, well, I want investments and I want some technology transfer to do it myself. So I think these are questions that we have to tackle. We don't have the answers to it, but it's clearly what comes up is the the liberalization angle with the regulatory part, with how do you help and support developing countries in having these investments and with a technological concern. I don't have the answers, but we need to look into.
I think we are now approaching the end of our event. So it was a very, very rich and interesting discussion, and we had an excellent exchange of ideas. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for joining us today, and the audience in person and online. And I'd like to thank the WTO for inviting us here and for organizing this week of very relevant and important events. Thank you.
Thank you so much.